So welcome back, everyone. I'm David Reiner. I'm one of the deputy directors of UKCCSRC, looking after systems and policy, and I've been looking at questions of public attitudes towards CCS and questions of public communications for far longer than I'd care to admit. And we have just this wonderful international panel that's been put together with some of the pretty much best people I could have imagined pulling onto the panel. So very happy that Karis did all the work and lined everybody up. And I don't know how many time zones we've got here. But I think we'll have what should be an excellent session. Because of the way this is working, I think what we'll do is we'll actually treat it as a series of 5 talks rather than a panel discussion. As Kara said, we could let maybe people get back to bed after their talk. So maybe without further ado, we can start the session. Each of the speakers is expected to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll allow about 5 minutes for questions. So the first speaker is someone known well to us here at UKCCSRC, is Jan Hopman. From CATO, the Dutch, there you go, Jan, the Dutch National R&D Program for CCS. Please, Jan, you have the floor, 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So, yeah, it's a pleasure to present here. Also, I'm in between very big countries, and then my small country is also invited, and I'm privileged to be on the first seat. Also, the time difference with the Netherlands is easy here for me. So, next slide, please. Yeah, and then push the button. Yes, that's good. So, what is CATO in a glance? We are representing the Netherlands in R&D, CCUS R&D. So, for the world and for Europe. Next slide, please. And then I always start with this slide, Paris 2015, where we agreed a number of agreements. So next slide, please. We said, let's stay below 2 degrees centigrade and preferably below 1.5 centigrade. And this is a, next slide, challenge. You see the interactiveness is really interactive. Thanks for that. And also, if you look about the urgency, next slide, please. I like to go to to the carbon countdown clock, and this was the clock 2 days ago, where we see how much CO2 we can emit until we reach the 2 degrees, and it says at the lower part 14 years, 119 days. So from now, so around the year, 2036, 37. We are there, and that means if we continue like this, like emitting like we do today, and we abruptly stop in 2037, we will meet the 2 degrees centigrade. And if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we have to stop immediately today. So there is something to do, and CCS is one of the building blocks to reduce the CO2 emission. I also had so to make it a bit scientifically, the next slide, please, or the next, please push the button. Last year, roughly the same date, I also presented this here, and I checked the numbers, and indeed it's, if you look to the lower line, it's really 15 years. It was last year, and this year it's 14 years. So every year it really reduces with 1 year. Next slide, please. Now something about the Netherlands, and now I think you have to push a number of buttons. This is the roadmap made in 2018 for the Netherlands on CCS, where in the middle arrow, and then please push a number of buttons. We see, we started with, it's in Dutch, but you can maybe check this. We start with defining projects in the Netherlands, then realizing them starting from 2021. That was the idea at that time. And then after 2025, build further extra new CCS projects in the Netherlands. And to do that, you need also some constraints to be accomplished. So if we go to the first one, then you need to be, so please push a few buttons. So the yellow one on the top, you need an instrument, incentives for industry to go for CCS. And this is what we've done in the Netherlands now. There is a subsidy scheme. I think this is something similar as in the UK. You also need specific instruments for the starting up projects, so the first projects. And you need companies that invest, and that's also happened in the Netherlands. We have some state-owned companies that give a push for CCS storage, transport and storage especially. Also, if you go to the gray one, you need a legal frame, which is practically ready in the Netherlands. Some final adjustments because we had to change the law from only get gas and oil out of the subsurface and now putting something in. You needed to change something there. And also the next one, you need an R&D program. And of course, this is what we want as a CATO, but also we believe this is very important because not all knowledge is there, and you can gain really a lot with R&D. And if you only save a few percentage in cost, because the total cost is enormously, this reduces a lot. And last but not least, it's the public perception. It can kill programs. This has happened in the Netherlands, in Barendrecht, around 10 years ago. Public perception is very important, so you need to manage the public perception. Next slide, please. So in the Netherlands, we also did a transport and storage study, which was done by EBN and GasUnie, which are the Dutch state-owned companies for producing oil and gas in the Netherlands and distributing the oil and gas, or especially distributing the gas. And they made this study especially to check what is the capacity in the Netherlands. And next slide, please. What came out were some scenarios. Where are the CO2 emitting areas? And this is really there are a few points in the Netherlands, industrial areas where a lot of CO2 is emitted and which can be distributed to empty gas fields on the North Sea. And next slide, please. Yeah, so this gave the confidence that there is storage capacity. There is enough storage capacity for the coming decades, and that meant we could start projects. So I like to go through a number of projects here. So you see the dots in the Netherlands. On the left side in Amsterdam, there was the ATOS project. Around Rotterdam, we had the road project. Now we have Portos, Aramis, and CO2 Next. And in the southern part of the Netherlands, there is the Yara plant. And on the right, in the east of the Netherlands, there are two waste incinerators, AVR and Twents, that are capturing CO2. So to give a bit more detail about these projects, please go to the next slide. So the road project, this was, well, the first, well, big project by E.ON and Uniper together with TAQA as an oil and gas company for a coal-fired power plant. However, the idea started in 2008. A lot of preparation has been done also in the CATO 2 program. No, I don't say unfortunately. This project was cancelled in 2017. And the reason for that was not that it was a bad plan concerned to CO2 capture and storage, but it is coupled to a coal-fired power plant. And for political reasons, the Netherlands decided not to continue coal-fired power plants operations. And that meant the end of this project. And then the next slide. Or a nice cartoon at that time. Most of you have seen this because I showed this many times. But I think it's nice to see how people think about CCS. It's ugly and necessary. Next slide, please. Nowadays, we have the Portos project, which is the, well, some kind of continuation or using a lot of information from the road project. It's a transport and storage company founded by EBN Gasunie and Port of Rotterdam, that are all state-owned companies. And the idea is to collect CO2 in the Rotterdam area and bring it to the North Sea, to the old fields of Taka. Capacity roughly 2.5 megatons per year, and this for roughly 15 years. And they already have customers, Air Liquide, Air Products, and ExxonMobil and Shell. At the moment, they are ready for an FID. Everything is ready. However, in the Netherlands, we have another issue, and this has to do with environmental emission of nitrogen or NOx and these things, and that stops new big initiatives on building. And there is now they are working on solving this, that they can continue or that they can make an FID for Portos. Next slide, please. In Amsterdam, a few years later, after Portos, there was the Atos, so all the musketeers are coming or were to come to the Netherlands. This was also by EBN and Gasunie, but then the Port of Amsterdam together with Tata Steel, and Tata Steel is close to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, is the biggest emitter of the Netherlands with roughly 5 million tons per year. This plan had a capacity of 1 to 7.5 megatons per year. However, since Tata Steel, the biggest customer or the biggest partner, the biggest emitter, changed their future plans to shift to hydrogen, to use hydrogen, this project was cancelled in 2021. Next slide, please. Then, after Portos, also Aramis has been announced last year, which is an initiative from Total Energies, Shell, and again EBN and Gasunie. The idea is here to build on, or let's say, where Portos is using one or a few fields close to Rotterdam. Aramis is also looking further to further fields further on the North Sea, and basically doing the same, collecting CO2 and putting it in the subsurface under the North Sea. Capacity in the order of 5 megatons per year. Then the next initiative. Next slide, please. It's very nice. It's CO2. And next, it was also announced last year, and this is a initiative from Gasunie, again, the state-owned company, together with Vopak and Gas Terminals. Basically, it's a kind of buffer of CO2, so collecting some CO2, buffering, and they are aligning with Aramis to get a kind of constant flow to pick up the peaks and the valleys in the CO2 input, and to align that with the transport to the North Sea, that it's a continuous stream of CO2. Next slide, please. Then the last one announced a few weeks ago. This is Yara. Yara is a Norwegian company, but in the southern part of the Netherlands, they are producing fertilizers and some other stuff. Also, a serious emitter of CO2, and they made a deal with the Northern Lights project in Norway, and to transport around 0.8 megatons, so a serious amount of CO2, to Norway, which will be stored there. Next slide, please. There is the 2 waste incinerators on the east part of the Netherlands. A bit smaller amounts, however, still serious and good for technology development. It's 60 kilotons per annum, what they capture, and they bring that to the greenhouses. So it's used for horticulture and some other small utilizations. But operational since 2019 and working according to plan. The next slide, please. Which is the last, and there are the last project in the Netherlands. There are some more initiatives, but I cannot mention all of them. It's Twents, also a waste incinerator, and waste to energy, I should say, like AVR. Since 2014, they collect already 100 kilotons per year, and also this is used for the majority for horticulture. So next slide, please. The conclusion, it's, I think in the Netherlands, the signs are on green, and we really are going to realize CCS, CCUS in the Netherlands. So the lights are on green. David, do you have questions?
Jan, that's slightly different than the talk you gave a couple of years ago, I think, you know, when things were looking amber, at best, I think. Right?
Yeah.
So why don't we see if there are questions in the audience? I already have one online.
And could you increase the volume for me?
For you. Okay. Okay, yeah, they're giving you a thumbs up. Hopefully it's better. There's a question right here in the audience. Right there.
Please use a microphone. Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me all right? Excellent.
Yes.
So thank you for that. I'm just wondering, you mentioned about how public attitudes sort of put paid to the Barendrecht project 10 years ago. So just wondering what Netherlands have done to rehabilitate the reputation of CCS to get you to the stage where you are now.
Yes, so I think the biggest important part is that the Barendrecht case there, the idea was, or the plan was, to store the CO2 onshore, so below the city of Barendrecht. And also there were some ideas in the northern part of the Netherlands where was public opposition. The plans now are all offshore. So that's one important thing, technical solution that has happened there. I think also what happened here is that the necessity of CO2 to reduce the CO2 emissions came after Paris. In Paris, the whole world announced that and declared that they had to reduce the CO2 emissions. And this was still far from everybody's house, but in the years after Paris, the countries have to make plans and show how they are going to reduce their CO2. And then it became more or less obvious that CO2 is an important building block in reducing the CO2. So the story, because we have a clear goal now, there is a clear problem, and we can now explain that CCS is quite of necessary. People are so public is going in a bit more positive way, and so it's still nobody likes it. It's ugly, but the tendency is that the understanding comes that that it's necessary.
We have a question online from Spence, who asks whether you could clarify the status of the Portos project and any current issues with approval.
Yeah, so this, okay, clarification. In the Netherlands, we have an environmental issue. So there is a lot of emission of NOx, we say, and the nitrogen. I say the connection, the chemical part where nitrogen is in it. This needs to be reduced a lot. And we didn't do that last year. So now there is even some environmental NGOs, they went to the court and they got right. So our government is really, not obeyed. They have to reduce the CO2 emissions. So this means that big building initiatives are stopped for the moment, because also during building a lot of NOx and nitrogen is getting into the atmosphere or into the environment. And so especially the Portos Project, and it's now, let's say the Portos Project is good for the CO2 emission reduction on one hand, but still during building this project, there is emission of nitrogen. And so they are stopped by law, I would say. And they are now working on finding a solution on how to make a trade-off and to get the Portos project running again. The Portos project itself, they are, well, practically, and never say 100% until they started or till they made the FID, but they are ready for to make an FID.
Great. Thank you, Jan. Any final questions? Yeah, one right here. Oh, sorry, Stuart.
All right, Stuart Hazeldine from Edinburgh. You mentioned there might be subsidies to get these first projects to work. How would that work for Porthos or Aramis? Who pays ultimately to store the CO2?
Yeah, so there is so at the moment we have these subsidies. That this is a kind of contract for difference with the current CO2 or emission prices. It's practically a commercial so they don't even need subsidies, I think, with these prices today. And this will be also the incentive for the future. So who pays is the companies that emit the CO2. They save the money, or they earn the money from the emission. They don't have to pay a fee for the emission, and this money is used, so they pay a fee for transport and storage to Aramis and to Portos, and maybe in the future others. And so it's the saving of the emission scheme.
And then maybe a final question here. No, the lady in the blue.
Hi, it was actually a really similar question to Stuart's. I was going to ask, for the two projects that you mentioned, Twence and AVR, the ones that are operational, whether they're economically viable through the sale of the CO2 to the greenhouses, or if they were subsidised by the government, and perhaps you could comment on the subsidies that were then available to get those intermediate scale projects off the ground.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the amount of subsidy they got, but for the building, so for the capex, I'm pretty certain they received a subsidy. For the greenhouses, the prices that the greenhouses pay for CO2 was always in the order of 100 euros, so which is, I don't know, 80 pounds or so per ton, which makes a more or less commercial basis for the OPEX. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. Brilliant. Really appreciate that. But we have 4 more speakers, so I better move on or I'll get in trouble with Karis. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Tip Meckel, who's at the Bureau of Economic Geology, known to many of us, kind of one of the centers of expertise on Earth Sciences related to CCS at the University of Texas at Austin. Tip will be talking to us. I'm not sure if you can cover all of the U.S., but giving your perspective on these issues at the moment.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to interact with this group on a day like this. I would love to be there. I remember my visits to the area fondly, and hopefully I'll get a chance to come back and visit again soon. But in the meantime, we'll do it remotely. It is a lot to try and take on the whole U.S. Right now. It's actually probably at its most accelerated rate in a decade. So what I thought I would do was cover some of the things that relate to our legislative and financial aspects. That's what most people tend to be curious about right now. And then I will transition a little bit to the Gulf Coast, where I have most of my expertise in thinking about the project development and large-scale hub implementation. So with that, I'll just say that it's rare in the U.S. that you get such a large bill or act passed through our Congress. In recent years, we've seen so much struggle with that in the upper right, you'll see that's our head of our Senate Chair Schumer, actually looking happy for once. He's usually looking quite frustrated. So you don't see him happy very often. He's happy because they did pass the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. We call it the IRA. And so this was an enormous funding measure that has very little precedent in recent memory in the United States. So it is a very big deal. And it will actually carry this program in the energy transition for many years, and certainly into the next administration. So it is a lot of carrots and not so many sticks. So if you're thinking about broad policy measure, the U.S. has tended to follow the credit scenario, where we're offering tax credits and infrastructure tax breaks, production tax credits, etc. And very few sticks, not a lot of taxes or caps on emissions, as you might see in other places. So the bill itself is extremely broad. There's no way to possibly cover all of it, but most of the focus is actually on EVs and renewables and power sector, etc. So the CCS component of it is the most significant funding we've ever seen in CCS in the United States, but it's not the main element of this big funding package by far. And if you followed the U.S. news on this, it was politics at its finest. There was one holdout, our Senator Manchin, who is from West Virginia and wanted pipeline aspects included. And then we had Sinet Sistema wanting some carried interest things. So if you're thinking about policy measures and how to get large policy implementation to happen, at least in our country right now, it seems that you can have single issues that actually hold up entire funding measures. So the graphic on the lower right just explains on the left side what the Inflation Reduction Act is invested in. You'll see in purple the parts that are CCS. So there's about $3.2 billion that are kind of in the tax credit realm, and then there's a clean hydrogen tax credit that's at about 13 billion. So a lot of money, but those circles are actually relatively small when you compare them overall to the different elements that are in here. And then you can see by the arrows where those things are going. They're going into power, they're going into industry, and they're going a small portion into transport. I will point out that previously you may have heard about our bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed back in 2021. That's on the right side here. That actually had a lot in it for CCS as well, and it was all on the infrastructure side. So you'll see demonstration infrastructure at 11 billion, hydrogen hubs and whatnot at about 9.5 billion, and then the plugging of orphaned wells at about $4.5 billion. In the end, there was actually more money in the infrastructure law for CCS implementation than there actually is in the IRA. So it's pretty interesting because the IRA provides all the carrot, but the infrastructure law provides all of the actual mechanism for building things that you would need. So it's a combination of these two that's actually going to propel CCS quite radically in the near future in the U.S. So quickly, what happened? You're probably aware of our existing 45Q tax structure where we had $50 a tax credit for CCS in saline formations and about $35 for enhanced oil recovery. In the new IRA modification, those numbers are actually lower, 17 and 12, but those are called baseline costs. So that's what you can get if you just do those two activities without any consideration for some things that come attached in this next line, which is prevailing wages, hours, apprenticeship requirements, etc. So there's a whole lot of added labor aspects that boost those things now to $85 for sequestration and $60 for enhanced oil recovery. And 85 is a number that is actually pretty familiar to the U.S. community. It's the number that the National Petroleum Council was suggesting back a couple years ago as the number that would be needed to get a significant amount of CCS implemented in the near term. So it's really no surprise we ended up at the $85. And then you can see down below there's similar boosts for DAC. DAC is now actually going to be up at the $180 a ton credit for sequestration and $130 for EOR utilization using direct air capture. So we see a lot of exciting announcements around direct air capture in the United States as well, and we actually know that out in West Texas we're gonna see a financial investment decision on DAC here very soon. Okay, so that's one part of it. This gets down into the weeds, but if you're interested in policy, this stuff will matter for you. The qualification for facilities is only going to apply to those things that start basically in 2023 or later, so next year. So it's a point forward kind of implementation. It broadens the definition of what a qualified facility is, which is important because it used to be that you had to capture at least 100,000 tons or sometimes up to 500,000 tons from a utility. Now those numbers are much lower, down in the 10,000 ton range, so you can actually amalgamate those from multiple sources, and this will really benefit the ethanol and gas processing communities who have lots of relatively small emissions, but they can be amalgamated and qualify. So the qualified facility definition is been relaxed. So this is, I mentioned that the 12,500 tons a year capture, and then the DAC facility will be treated as a qualified facility if you do anything above 1,000 tons of carbon annually. So they're really lowering the bar for what you have to do to qualify here. Okay, the next element that's pretty exciting and many of us didn't think would make it into the bill is the direct pay option. This is an interesting element whereby if you basically can elect to receive a direct payment in lieu of and for the same amount as the 45Q tax credit. So that means that essentially if I have a $10 million tax liability and I submit $15 million in tax credits, I can actually get a $5 million payment in return in real dollars. So it's converting CO2 into real dollars, not just tax credits. This is available for the first 5 years for all projects and up to 12 years for special qualification like tribes and our Tennessee Valley Authority and et cetera. The other thing that's interesting is on the private activity bond side. It says that it revises the amount by which the credit is reduced for facilities that are funded with private activity bonds. This is basically saying you can't simultaneously get a break on a bond and the full tax credit. So it's in there as a mechanism for making sure there's an appropriate deployment of those bonds. Okay, moving on quickly here to the last bit, there's a transferability of credit. This is something that really changed the solar and wind tax credit market in the United States. You can elect to monetize that credit and essentially sell it for cash. And this is a major departure from the previous IRS tax credit guidance. This means that you can essentially amass the credit as the capture owner or the storage owner, and then you can essentially sell that credit to another entity like a bank or some other entity for cash. And that's pretty interesting in terms of understanding how it will accelerate our ability to fund these projects. Okay, so moving on to the sort of the U.S. Big picture. This is a study that Princeton led, a very vast study on all sorts of things, but they do have a section on CCS, and this is just one map that many take exception to, but in principle it's more or less correct. That is, that most are beginning to believe that the vast majority of the best storage in the United States is going to occur in the Gulf Coast region. And that's because it's a relatively young and very thick sedimentary basin with extremely high injectivity and very, very large capacity. So you can see these gray boxes down below representing upwards of, say, 75% of the annual storage capacity as compared to some of these other basins. So again, there are plenty of reasons to take exception with this, but I think most are beginning to realize that there's a real incredible national asset in the Gulf Coast. So thinking about that in particular, this Gulf Coast map here, you can see that this is kind of a heat map for CCS emissions. You'll see there's some big emissions in the southern Alabama and Mississippi areas of the central Gulf of Mexico. But then the big emissions pick up along the Mississippi River corridor there, and then westward over into Lake Charles in western Louisiana and the Beaumont-Port Arthur area in southeast Texas, across to the Houston area, which is by far the highest concentration of emissions between Beaumont and Port Arthur and Houston, down into Freeport, and all the way down south to Corpus Christi and even Brownsville. So that's kind of where our emissions are focused, and so it's not surprising that most of our activity is developing near there. So this is a very busy map, and those of you that have seen many of my presentations probably have seen it before, but very quickly, the yellow line represents existing CO2 pipelines that are in the Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas areas. The blue dots are our emission sources again. And what I want to highlight here for this group is that there's actually leases being taken for storage at this point. So this black symbol there in southeast Texas at the Texas-Louisiana border is actually a 63 square mile offshore lease that Talos initiated about a year ago. Chevron recently bought into that project with 50% ownership, and that project is progressing with a lease in hand. There are two other offshore announcements in state waters. These are by Venture Global, a big LNG company. One is in Cameron Parish in western Louisiana, about 28 square mile lease in the offshore state waters. Another is about a 16 square mile lease over sort of south of New Orleans, west of the Mississippi Delta. So these have not yet been finally approved by the state of Louisiana, but they are in the process of being approved. The last thing, and then I'll say that I'm working on a proposal for Corpus Christi down here in central Texas right now. So that will probably be the next star that comes along. I will point out that in the lower middle, you'll see that there's a map with lots of pink rectangles. And these are all publicly available 3D seismic data sets in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because there's a 25-year moratorium on the data sets. These were data that were collected 25 years ago for oil and gas exploration. They're now public. So you essentially see that a vast majority of the Gulf of Mexico is basically available for free prospecting for CCS at this point. And I'll point out that the federal rules in the offshore continental shelf are due in November. I suspect that'll just be a draft, and then it'll take a bit longer to work through the final rules. Okay. One thing I want to point out is that we've got some announced storage capacities in the Gulf Coast, and the horizontal axis is the lease area in square miles. Apologies for the U.S. units here, but so and then the vertical axis is the stated CO2 storage capacity in millions of tons. And so you'll see that these announcements are coming in sort of between the 2 to 4 million tons per square mile lines that you're seeing there. So we do have some announcements that are suggesting, as much as 500 million tons of storage, but that would be sort of on the high side of what's been announced recently. And I will say that right now it feels a little bit like the Wild West in terms of capacity and justifying capacity. So I expect these will all get modified as time goes on. One thing that I want to bring up is that in the Gulf of Mexico, we do have a sort of a structural limitation, and that is, at least in our Texas state waters, our structures are relatively low amplitude. So we have about 25 to 30 meter closures in most of our traditional hydrocarbon settings. That's not tremendous. That's relatively small. And so we're talking about, you know, potential historical oil field sizes in the tens of millions of barrels, maybe 50 million barrels. Or you could think of it as like a TCF size gas field is extremely large in the Texas state waters. And this may ultimately be an important point for development in the Gulf Coast, whereby the difference between injecting on structure in a closure versus on structure in, say, a fetch area might become a really important topic, and that's one we pursue at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center pretty aggressively right now, is understanding that. Okay, and then to wrap up, if I tried to reduce the 6 main hubs in Texas, if I try and reduce their emissions by 2050, it would be about 120 million tons of captured CO2 if we went at the 90% level. So if we try and hit 120 million tons of capture by 2050, we have to grow at about a 9.5% rate. That's pretty aggressive for an industrial growth trend. But we know that over that time you might store a little over a gigaton of CO2, and that probably about $100 billion of tax credits would be assigned to that amount. And so you see these blue dots coming up to that 100 million ton a year injection, let's say, by 2050 with these kinds of growth rates. So that's pretty high, but you can see that the tax credits end up being on the order of $10 to $12 billion a year for those kinds of emissions reductions. So that's what I wanted to leave you with, and look forward to hearing from the other panelists. Thanks.
Questions? Please, over here.
Hi, Muir Freer, University of Manchester. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was fantastic. I think it's really exciting outcomes from this new IRA tax credit, and great consideration has been given to DACs. But would other forms of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, be considered for the tax credits, potentially bioenergy, carbon capture storage, or potentially afforestation? Thank you.
Yeah, in that bill, it's generally looking at the industrial. The part I'm familiar with is looking at the industrial capture for traditional CCS. I think if you were to speak to somebody else who understood our agricultural sector or forestry sector a bit better, they would be able to answer that question far better than I would. I do know that there are agricultural groups in the Gulf Coast who are actively banking carbon credits and trying to figure out how that market works. I would say it's way behind where the industrial CCS market is right now.
Thanks very much. Hi, Tip, it's Owen Tucker from Shell. It's a really exciting picture where you showed that the huge storage resource sitting in the Gulf Coast. Especially with respect to the onshore storage resource, how much of it do you think is going to be compromised by legacy well penetrations that the EPA or LDNR or Texas Railroad Commission have to approve for the Class 6?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as you know, there's over 1 million wells drilled in the state of Texas alone. There's probably something, maybe half that in Louisiana. Onshore, and so that's a significant challenge when you go. I cannot go to a single Texas coastal county and find a location that's more than 1 mile from a existing wellbore. If I put a buffer around the existing wells of 1 mile, I get nothing. So we know that onshore you're definitely going to be taking on legacy well issues, and they could be in the dozens for the scale projects that we're talking about. When you move into the offshore segment, because of the higher costs of traditional oil and gas exploration, there's a real drop in the number of wells that are out there. And this is in a draft paper I can send you a copy of if you're interested in. But the number of wells drops off, their age is generally lower, and they generally tend to be mostly deeper. Which is not necessarily a good thing for CCS. I can find significant areas that are more than a mile from existing wellbores there. But your question is well taken, and as we develop the federal regulations with OCS and BOEM, they're really focused on the capacity part right now, but I think they're also going to need to consider the legacy well issues as well. And I would not be surprised if there's, in the end, entire segments of that map that I showed you that are more or less, ranked really, really low for prospectivity just because of the density of wells that exist. I would just add, though, that if you looked at the greater Gulf of Mexico, if you took that map and put it into the United States or on top of UK, we're talking about enormous areas that are available. It would rival, the recent announcement on the northern Australian shelf for that project offshore Darwin. We're talking about areas that are about that big, thousands and tens of thousands of square miles that are available. It's like your North Sea.
Stuart Hazeldine from Edinburgh. I've never really understood how the tax credit thing works. So if you're paid by tax credits, how does that work for the country as a whole? Is that free money, or does that money come back into the federal government by taxes on employees or their spending power or something? How can that be sustainable to give away 100 billion?
Yeah, if I had the opportunity to do another degree right now, it would be in the macroeconomics of carbon management. I find it fascinating. It's essentially a money shell game, right? The federal government is taking in less tax and allocating it out, but it's being spent on projects that generate taxable income like materials, labor, etc. And so I leave it up to the people that bean count at the federal level to understand how that shell game works. But I will tell you that in the Texas state waters, all of the lease revenue goes into the state permanent school fund. So the state of Texas is basically seeing a federal tax credit as a way to boost their state educational fund. So it gets to be a very interesting circle, Stuart, in terms of that shell game. I'm fascinated by it. I'd love to come work with you guys on it.
Well, maybe we could exchange dogmas on that. That'd be because you're much smarter in the United States at making money. We're good at spending it and borrowing it.
Yeah, remember the big change from the old 45Q, which existed even 10 years ago, to today, is that I can take that tax credit and either get a direct payment back to me if I've overpaid my tax liability, or I can sell it to a third party. So now you've turned a credit into an actual dollar. And that's a huge change for the finance community, because now they can see dollars coming in rather than credits coming in, and that changes their calculus on this extremely.
We probably have to draw a line under it. Tip, thank you very much. Brilliant. Really appreciate it. My Northern Irish colleagues aren't very keen on this whole IRA thing, but anyhow, that's a separate issue.
Yeah, I thought about that. Maybe it's not the best moniker for that for you guys.
Third speaker, who's been involved in these issues for many years, Norm Sacuta, who's Director of Communications at the PTRC, the Petroleum Technology Research Center in Regina. Norm, welcome. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a while.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes and then another 5 minutes or so of questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so I just thought I'd say I am not the best at technical things. I've spent 10 years doing that with engineers, but I have an MFA in creative writing. So, if there's major questions that are of a technical basis on this, I can always forward anything that I can answer to the Science and Engineering Research Committee of Aquastor, who are involved in most of the CCS research happening in Canada. So just a brief outline, I'm going to go through the Government of Canada's recent tax incentives that were announced for the CCUS in April of this year. I don't know, again, I'm confusion about the US ones, whether I fully understand them, but I did get some good slides from the CCS Knowledge Center, which is located just in the building beside us here in Regina. I'm going to talk about the Alberta hub locations and the competition for that, and where they're going and where they are. I'm going to talk briefly, and when I put the slide deck together, I realized I did not put a slide in about Saskatchewan's approach, so I'm just going to talk about it after I talk about Alberta, which is odd because I'm in Saskatchewan, but you know, Alberta is a much bigger place with perhaps more detailed rules in place for storage. So I will then talk about what's happening in Saskatchewan. And then I'm going to talk a bit about Aquastore and about one project that we're involved with that involves the European Union and the University of Alberta. So that's what I'm going to do today. So the Government of Canada's CCU tax incentives. I love the cover of their budget. It's the same every year, happy families being happy and generally not noticing all the horrible things happening around them. So that's what the budget cover looks like. And the budget talked about, it was released in April, an investment tax credit for capital invested in CCUS projects. And they've been very aggressive. They want to capture at least 15 megatons of CO2 annually. I think they're aiming for 2030 for that to happen. And that's why the credits are so high at the beginning of the program from 2022 to 2030. And then they kind of trail off if you're planning to introduce capture projects later after 2030. So the reason why they have that discrepancy is to try to speed along CCUS projects fairly quickly before 2030 so that they can help meet certain targets. By the way, CO2 EOR is not included. That can't be one of the utilizations. It either has to be a different kind of utilization or storage. So this is kind of how it works. For direct air capture, you can get up to 60% of your costs back. All other CCUS projects around 50%, and then for transport, storage, and use, 37.5% back. And again, this is a credit that would go back onto the expenditures that you made for the CCS project itself. And then, of course, in 2031 to 2040, they're reduced significantly, basically cut in half. So you really do want to get your CCS project up and operating as quickly as possible in Canada in order to fully get the tax credits that you need. These two slides, by the way, are from the International CCS Knowledge Center, which is really good about regulation and capture technologies. They were involved intimately, many of the staff there, with the CCUS project at Boundary Dam, which is capturing 2,800 tons a day. So they have a great deal of experience on the regulatory and on the capture side. So anyway, they, as I say, they hope to reduce the GHG emissions by 40 to 45% below the 2005 levels by 2030. The credit eligibility levels will drop, as I've mentioned, after 2030. And they put a cap on the time frame for the credit that will be completely over by 2040. So this is the basic outline of what the credit does and what it's supposed to be motivating. So in Alberta, Alberta, as you know, has been capturing CO2 from one of the main projects is the Quest project, which is Shell. And now I think that the CO2 project itself is being managed by CNRL. Shell has sold that to CNRL. If I have that wrong, I'm sure the Shell person in the audience will correct me on that. But basically, that's been going on for a number of years. They have 6 million tons that are stored near Edmonton to the northeast of Edmonton. In the same deep saline formation where Aquastore is storing. It's about 800 kilometers away from our location. We're much deeper. We're at 3.2 kilometers. The Deadwood formation up there is around 2 kilometers. So that's where they've been injecting. But there is also the carbon trunk line, which I'll talk about in the next slide, that is also in existence that's capturing CO2 from the area around Edmonton, a couple of locations, and using it for enhanced oil recovery in the center of Alberta at, I think, the Irvine field, I believe is what it's called. So anyway, so the development of additional CO2 hubs really began in late 2021 with a request for full proposals from the energy regulator in Alberta. March 31st, 6 proposals were chosen to move forward to full proposals. And as I've said, most of the hub proposals have multiple sources, but they do tend to be located in the Edmonton area, which is referred to as the industrial heartland in Alberta, because a lot of the industrial processes, everything from cement plants to refineries to upgraders, are located in that area, as well as petrochemical uses. So most of the hub locations will use as their sources those areas around in and around Edmonton, not exclusively, but that's the largest areas. So the 6 hub locations that were chosen, and I wish I could show you a map with their direct locations on them, but many of those projects are in the process of determining where exactly their wells are going to be. PTRC is involved with a couple of these projects, kind of acting as a third-party validator of characterization of sites and of MMV to accompany those hub locations. So I can't really say who they are because there's confidentiality there, but these are the 6 locations. And again, they all overwhelmingly, every one of them are located at or near the city of Edmonton, either to the west of it or to the east of it or to the northeast. This particular example that I show here is of the carbon trunk line. That is the one that's heading down. It's operated by Enhanced Energy and Wolf Midstream, and they operate the trunk line to send CO2 down for the purposes of enhanced oil recovery in central Alberta near Red Deer. So this is how hub locations are developing. Okay, before I get into Aquastor, I should mention Saskatchewan is taking the approach of not necessarily doing at a legislative level, so at the government level, a call for proposals on hub locations. They're preferring that it get driven by the private sector. There is one hub location that PTRC has actually been asked to be involved with that involves Whitecap Resources, who are the current managers of the Weyburn Field, owners and managers, where about 40 million tons of CO2 has been sequestered for use in enhanced oil recovery. So the Whitecap operators and Federated Co-op, which is a refinery in Regina, are looking to have a hub location, which they're working out where it's going to be. But there's a number of additional industries that would be involved with that. Regina is a bit like Saskatchewan's industrial heartland, the same way Edmonton is in Alberta. So there's an ethanol plant near here, there's potash operations, there's a refinery, there's a steel mill. All of those sources could potentially be used for that hub location. But Saskatchewan's approach has been for individual operators to get together and present a proposal on storage hubs to the province, and then they will go forward with an evaluation of those proposals. So let's move on quickly to Aquastor. The Aquastor project, I think many of you know what it is. The CO2 is being captured from Boundary Dam, about 2,800 tons a day off a coal-fired plant there. Most of the CO2, about 90% of it, goes to the Weyburn oil field. That's what this map shows. This is to scale, by the way, very important to be to scale when you're trying to do public outreach on CCS, to actually show people just how deep you're injecting. This little dot up here, we have a pull-up banner that we take to our events here in Saskatchewan that shows the power plant itself and just how deep you're going into the Deadwood Formation. And then there's also a pipeline that goes here to the Weyburn oil field, and their field of injection is 1.5 kilometers down. Ours is 3.2 kilometers. So we are storing in a deep saline formation. We get about 10% of the CO2 coming from Boundary Dam. The other 90% is sold for enhanced oil recovery. Oh. So this is the total amount of CO2 up to, I think, the end of July that had been captured off Boundary Dam. They did have some startup issues, and they have ongoing small issues related to, lignite coal is not the best coal to use for carbon capture and storage, but that's what they're using at Boundary Dam. So there's issues with filters and having to clean them. But as each year passes, they're getting more and more efficient. As you can see, they had shut down here in the middle of probably COVID related as well. And they've been doing fairly well in terms of the total volume of CO2 captured in different months. So they're at 4.5 million. As you can see, 450,000 tons have been stored at Aquastor in the deep saline formation, which means basically the rest, so 4 million tons, has gone to Weyburn for injection for EOR purposes. And that's the basic idea for the capture from Boundary Dam, is that 90% goes to EOR, 10% comes to us for the purposes of really study and research. So I'm going to click through this really quickly. This is the power plant over here on the right. These two little red dots are the injection and observation well at Aquastor. And I'm just going to go through all the MMV that's located at this site and which has been operating for the past 10 years. The study area is 5.5 by 5.5 kilometers. We have a geophone array of 630 geophones that are permanently there, 2.5 kilometers square around the injection and observation well. There's also what we like to call, these are the geophones, there's the seismic array. We also have kind of super stations for measurement and monitoring. We do soil gas sampling, of course. We do well water sampling, both in that area and with nearby farmers, to make sure that there's been no CO2 going into those. We know that if there's going to be a leak at the Aquastor site, we're going to find it way, way lower in different layers through the distributed acoustic and other kinds of signal devices that are down well. So we'll be able to determine if there's a leak happening way below this. But we do this for public assurance and for making sure that everyone in the local community are happy with what we're doing. And then we also have some interesting GPS tilt meters in SAR, just to see if there's any swelling or shifting of earth. These have basically indicated absolutely nothing at the site. So as part of a general knowledge that we might say to other operators who are thinking of putting MMV at a new CCS site, everything specific to the geology that you're dealing with, but we found much of this particular equipment not to be useful, and it's very expensive. So, we might suggest that there's other forms of down well fiber optic things that could be done that would be better than this. So this just tells you basically there's 31 different kinds of technologies being tested at the site. It is really kind of the largest field laboratory in the world for testing different kinds of MMV technologies. And we have many different companies, including companies from Japan and different companies that I really can't, because of confidentiality, talk about, that have technologies, who are actively trying to test things at the site to see if they can bring their costs down to be offered to other potential CCUS sites for their measurement and monitoring. So this is some recent results. This was the seismic shoots we did very early at 36,000 tons. And then as we progressed over the years to 102, 150, and 272,000 tons of the reservoir. Basically, repeat surveys, because of the set array, have been very, very strong in being able to be compared with each other and where exactly the CO2 plume is going, 3.2 kilometers underground. But it seems to not be increasing its size and direction based on the models that we originally did. And why is that happening? Well, basically, it's because we think there's a flexure within the reservoir. You can see there's almost a straight line here, that's the injection and observation well, that the CO2 doesn't seem to be moving at all to the southwest, seems to be moving mostly north and northwest. So we think, as we said, we don't think this is a fault. We think that it's some differences within the Deadwood Formation, that certain kinds of sediment that don't allow for the kind of permeability and porosity that we have in the rest of the reservoir. So because of that, we've had to use this information to update models, which is always a good thing, and to do new simulations. And it's a very interesting process, this whole project, and how the CO2 has appeared to be moving within the reservoir. So we've also done, most recently, this was just done a few months ago, cross-well data acquisition. And this is in order to be able, we have an injection and an observation well that are 150 meters apart. Basically, we go up and down, and we send this data acquisition between the two wells with basically streams of geophones and other seismic sources between the two. And then out of that, this is about to be examined, or it is being examined, and will be presented at the Aquastor annual meeting, which is going to be in Ottawa on October 4th and 5th. This data probably won't be shared with people or groups outside of those who pay for the access to the data, but there probably will be some academic papers that will arrive shortly and be published about it, with limited data for discussion. So one of the last thing I'll talk about is that the PTRC has been involved with the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta is leading this project from the Canadian standard in the Act 3 program, which many of you probably know about. This is accelerating CCS technologies, and it's meant to bring together researchers from different countries and internationally. The US is involved. The province of Alberta is involved, not the Canadian government, which chose not to participate, but rather the province of Alberta, and several European countries. And the PTRC agreed through the University of Alberta to allow access to its data for this project, which is called Advanced Multi-Temporal Modeling and Optimization of CO2 Transport Utilization and Storage Networks. So this is the list of organizations and countries that are involved with the Act 3 proposal. It looks like a lot of this is going to be involving neural networks and artificial intelligence in order to kind of synchronize sources with transport, with sinks, and to try to develop a program that could potentially do that regardless of the location that you're talking about. I believe that's what it's about. I think Rick Chalaturnik may be on the call, and any questions I get that I can't answer, because I don't fully understand this, I can forward to Rick. He's the lead. Actually, Gonzalo Zambrano is actually the lead at U of A, and he's working with Rick Chalaturnik on this project. This is just a few of basically the work program and what particular country is taking the lead on each. I'll just let you read that on your own. The storage and network risk dynamics, because there's been a lot of study of that at the Aquastore site, is being led by the University of Alberta. And then there's ICL, there's TNO, IFPN, and there's a lab in the US. I think that's the LANL. I can't remember now. It was listed in the list of companies that are involved. And this is just an example of the kind of data that we have at Aquastore. We've got, well gauge data, because Aquastore is a start and stop operation. We inject CO2 some days we don't at all, if they need to send all of it to the Weyburn oil field. And because of that, we have really interesting data about how you stop and start CO2 injection at an ongoing injection site. There's also lots of information. We've done spinner logs, we've done P&D logging, we've done all kinds of different ways to kind of view that CO2 and where it is in the reservoir, and being able to use that data as you're doing your artificial intelligence and other kinds of work is very useful. And so we will be sharing a fair amount of that data with the European partners, just to see if that will help them in their own work towards developing storage locations in Europe. And this is just another, that's the injection and the observation well. They're 150 meters apart. Kind of what DTS and DAS stuff is down well. We have acoustic sensing and temperature sensing, and also the ability to do seismic sensing with some of those fiber optic lines down well. So that data as well is likely to be shared in the project. So that's it for me. And if anybody has any questions, I hope I can answer them.
One is chomping at the bit, so right here.
Hi, I am your Shell man. So Shell does operate Quest. What it did was dilute. So 70% of Quest is owned by CNRL, 20% by Chevron, and 10% by Shell, but Shell's still the operator. And it's currently injected over 7 million tons.
Yeah, I know. The last time I looked, which was probably 6 months ago, it was 6. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me since then.
Thanks very much.
Great. Other questions? I think there's a question online about what sort of sound source is being used for the 4D seismic.
What's interesting, we used dynamite charges to begin with, and we've also expanded that to include fiber-sized vehicles. But the Japanese company that's working with us, JOGMEC, have a system called ACROSS, which is accurately controlled single source. I can't remember exactly what the acronym is for, but they have built an actual seismic source location that's permanent, about 1 kilometer away from the injection and observation well. And it's like, we like to describe it as a big off-kilter washing machine. It goes thump, thump, thump when they rev it up. And that source is actually being marketed to Middle Eastern companies. They're testing it and perfecting it at the Aquastore site, because any place where there's large locations where a set point source for seismic would be useful, they've been fairly successful at marketing it there. So it's a Japanese company called JOGMEC. It's a research firm. And so that is also one of the seismic sources that we use. And we're about to actually rev that up again in the winter with additional fiber optics at surface, fiber optic lines, to see what we can see in the subsurface.
Great. I don't think we have any other questions. So thank you, Norm. We actually do need more MFAs. As we move to deployment, we actually probably need people with your background more than maybe tons more earth scientists. Nothing personal. But thank you very much again. So our fourth speaker is Yoshihiro Sawada from Japan CCS, who's been with Japan CCS since 2010. And he served as Executive Managing Director and President, Corporate Advisor, General Manager of the International Affairs Department since 2017. And Sawada-san will be talking to us about the current situation in Japan. So welcome, thank you.
My name is Yoshihiro Sawada with Japan CCS. It is a great honor to make a presentation on the current status of CCS in Japan today, as I did last year. Although only a year has passed since my last presentation, CCS activities have been rapidly progressing in Japan. Next slide, please. This is an outline of my presentation, which will consist of CO2 injection and site survey project in Japan, key points of CCS roadmap study, Tomakomai project, site survey project, CO2 ship transportation project, and CO2 utilization project. Next, please. First, CO2 injection and potential storage site survey project in Japan. Next slide, please. This slide is a timeline of CO2 injection and potential storage site survey project in Japan. In the 1990s, two CO2 EOR demonstration projects were conducted. 10,000 tons of CO2 were injected for each project. In the early 2000s, a CO2 storage demonstration project was conducted, and 10,000 tons of CO2 was injected into a saline aquifer. Currently, Japan CCS is conducting the potential storage site survey project and the Tomakomai CCS demonstration project. Next slide, please. I will explain the key points of the intermediate summary of the CCS roadmap study. Next slide, please. In Japan, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, held meetings of a study group to discuss the long-term roadmap for CCS. And the result of the discussions were published as an intermediate report. The annual storage volume of CCS in 2050 is assumed to range from about 120 million to 240 million tons per year, with a view to carbon neutrality in 2050. This is a rough estimate, not a target value. If CCS projects are to begin in 2030, it was considered necessary to develop CCS legislation as early as possible, taking into account the long lead time of the site selection and the construction period. Next slide, please. The key points of the intermediate summary are as follows. The Japanese government has made a commitment to develop a business environment for the start of CCS project by 2030. The Japanese government will finalize the CCS long-term roadmap by the end of 2022. The Japanese government will take the following actions. First, domestic legislation for the implementation of CCS project will be studied, and the legislation for CCS projects will be developed as soon as possible in order to start CCS project by 2030. Next, effort will be made to reduce CCS costs. Next, the government will consider how it should support CCS project. The government will conduct a survey of potential storage site for CCS. The government will study how to provide support for advanced CCS projects. The government believes that there will be no incentive for operators to engage in CCS projects unless CAPEX and OPEX are at least fully covered. Next, public understanding of CCS project will be promoted. Finally, overseas CCS projects will be promoted. Knowledge sharing will be promoted through the Asia CCUS network, which was launched in 2021. Next, please. Next is an update of the Tomakomai CCS demonstration project, which is a flagship CCS project of Japan. CO2 was injected for 3 years and 8 months. And in November 2019, we achieved the target of 300,000 tons. Monitoring work is being continued and preparations for the next stage of the project are underway. Next slide, please. This is a project scheme. The CO2 emission source is a hydrogen production unit of an adjacent oil refinery, which provides a gas containing approximately 50% CO2. The CO2 capture facility has a capacity of 200,000 tons per year. After capture and compression, the CO2 is injected into 2 offshore subsea bed reservoirs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This slide shows the result of microseismicity monitoring. Prior to startup of injection, 9 events were recorded, and after startup, 3 events were recorded. And after injection was completed, 3 events have been recorded. All events occurred at depths much deeper than the injection area, and the microseismicity during and after injection occurred at the same depths and locations as that recorded before the startup of injection. Therefore, it can be concluded that they are all naturally occurring events and are related to the CO2 injection. No seismicity attributable to CO2 injection has been detected in the vicinity of the injection area. Next slide, please. We have conducted 3D seismic surveys prior to CO2 injection at 65,000 tons, 207,000 tons, and at 300,000 tons of CO2 injection. The bright spots correspond to the extent of the injected CO2 and confirm that the CO2 is being stably stored in a limited area around the injection well, and that the CO2 plume is evolving with the progress of injection. Next slide, please. The figure on the left shows the initial arrangement of the monitoring system. The monitoring system was comprised of observation wells, ocean bottom seismometers, an ocean bottom cable, and an onshore seismic station. As a result of an optimization study of the monitoring system, it was confirmed that the microseismicity monitoring of sufficient accuracy is possible with the onshore seismic station and ocean bottom seismometers. Therefore, it was decided to discontinue the operation of the onshore seismic station and ocean bottom seismometers after fiscal year 2021, as shown in the figure on the right. Next slide, please. Next, for the potential storage site survey project in Japan. Next slide, please. Japan CCS has been commissioned by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and the Ministry of the Environment to conduct surveys of potential sites for CO2 storage every year since fiscal year 2014. 3D seismic surveys have shown that Japan has considerable storage potential with a storage capacity of approximately 16 billion tons in the subsea bed geological formations around Japan. Next slide, please. Next, for the CO2 ship transportation project. Next slide, please. Due to the distances between the CO2 emission sources and storage locations in Japan, long-distance transportation by ship is believed to be more feasible than land transportation by such means as pipelines. To verify this, the Japanese government has commissioned a project to demonstrate long-distance transportation of CO2 to a consortium led by Japan CCS. The CO2 ship transportation project consists of 3 work scopes. The first scope is R&D and design of the commercial scale ship to transport CO2 at a scale of 1 million tons per year. The second scope is to build and operate a ship to transport CO2 at 10,000 tons per year to Tomakomai. The third scope is the study of ship transportation business models. Next slide, please. This slide is further explanation of scope 2 of the CO2 ship transportation project. We plan to demonstrate CO2 ship transportation by capturing and liquefying CO2 at a coal-fired power plant in Maizuru and transporting it to Tomakomai. The plan is to build and operate a ship with gross tonnage of approx 1,000 tons to transport CO2 under several CO2 conditions, including low temperature and low pressure. We are aiming to start the ship transportation demonstration in 2024, which will be the world's first CO2 ship transportation for CCS. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'll explain the CO2 utilization project. Next slide, please. In 2019, the Japanese government announced that it would utilize the Tomakomai CCS Center as a carbon recycling demonstration center. Japan CCS is supporting a government study. Next slide, please. Japan CCS and 5 companies have previously cooperated to combine the technology by Toshiba for the conversion of carbon dioxide CO2 into carbon monoxide CO with technology used to synthesize liquid fuel from CO and hydrogen to produce sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, and to study carbon recycling business models. This initiative was adopted as a commission project by the Ministry of the Environment in 2021. Next slide, please. This concludes my presentation on the current status of CCS in Japan. Thank you for your attention. And if you have a question, please speak slowly and clearly.
Questions? Questions? Oh, yes, in the back. John?
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. On shipping, are you looking at powered vessels, or do you also look at unpowered vessels, barges? Because perhaps that has some advantage in terms of storage at the point of dispatch.
Well, in case of Japan, weather condition, especially in winter, is very bad. So if we use the barge, I think it's not stable. So we prefer the powered vessels.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have maybe a quick question before we move on to our final speaker. But can you say more about kind of the prospects of funding for CCS in Japan? You know, is it? I mean, there's clearly, I think it's sort of stable. It seems like, but any kind of sense of kind of over the next 5 or 10 years, any new funding?
Well, the funding of CCS in Japan is very stable, but as Japanese government made a commitment to develop a CCS business environment. So I believe from now on, the funding will be increased year by year. And Japanese government said, for the first advanced project, they will cover all the capex and opex by the Japanese government. So the funding will be increased year by year.
Great. Thank you very much again, Sawada-san. And now for our final speaker, we have Professor Liang from UCL and also the Guangdong CCUS. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So how can I see
there we go. Yes, I see you.
The slide? Thanks, David.
Good to see you. Sorry you can't join us in person, I mean.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I see this as slightly running late, so I try to keep brief to give an overview about CCUS development progress in China. I am responsible for the UK-China CCS Center and also recently joined University College London. I can't see the slide, it's quite slow. So CCUS has become a much more important technology in the last couple of years, and since developed has been really fast in the last 2 years. This is mainly driven by China's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060, and that make CCUS very important technologies being named by many policy frameworks. And I can see the next couple of years there will be more funding and also more regulation in this area. And in Chinese Ministry of Science and Technologies 2021 report, and the role of CCUS become more important. Actually, many policy document and now is considered CCUS as a cornerstone or backbone technology for China's carbon neutrality goal. And in the past, it's usually considered as a strategic reserve technology or transition technologies. And people also realize the role of CCUS in negative carbon emission, including biomass and direct air capture. And there are also more application of CCUS in industry, such as cement and steel, and also many other manufacturing and industry sources. And in Guangdong, in 2013, the CCUS Center was launched, and it's still running with more people and more projects. And hopefully next year, there's a 10 years anniversary, and you can join our event, and we can hopefully have more progress. And in China, by April this year, there are about 21 projects operational, but more than another 20 projects are under construction, and a few projects are 500,000 ton, more than 1 million ton larger projects. So last couple of years, we saw more projects being developed than last 2 decades. So it's a really positive progress. And the CNPC PetroChina are developing a number of megaton CCUS projects. Initially, it has been developing the Xinjiang projects, aimed to get rid of 3 million tons of CO2 per year by 2030. Actually, the timeline may be brought forward. And CNPC is also doing CCUS hub in Daqing in northeast of China, Changqing in Portos Project, Dagang oil field, and these hubs are also likely being complete by 2030. And they are the latest development. They are also working on CCUS in the north part of Hainan province. There are some onshore oil field and the reservoir. And actually, CNPC has already piloted a number of CCUS CO2 storage at their oil field, including Changqing oil field, which is 50,000 ton per year pilot. And there are many of these pilots in China. And Sino is an offshore oil company in China, actually developing one of the largest projects, and with ExxonMobil and Shell and the Guangdong provincial government hope to use 2 stages to develop a 10 million ton CCUS cluster with the initial stage reach 3 to 5 million ton CO2 per year. And this project actually was the original Guangdong CCUS roadmap recommendation dating back to 12 years ago. And Sinopec has one project been launched last year in July, capturing 1 million tons CO2 from Qilu petrochemical plant from high concentration source and transport by pipeline for CO2 EOR and some CO2 for Sinai aquifer, a bit like Weyburn project. And the project has been constructed really fast and already started construction, started operation a couple of weeks ago. So in the next 5 years, Sinopec will start another 2 megaton CCUS project in East China oil field and also in Jiangsu oil field. And this project is really exciting, and it has been a bit of time. As I think Stuart and John knows, it's difficult to get hold of CNOOC 6 or 7 years ago, but since China announced the carbon neutrality goal, CNOOC used a really unbelievable way to work on offshore CO2 storage in Sinai Formation. So this project is likely to start operational next year, maybe the first offshore CO2 storage project in Asia to go get CO2 into deep water under the oil field reservoirs. The storage depth is 800 meters. And I was on the panel in reviewing this project. I can see about 200 CNOOC engineers sitting in the same room to work on the project and listen to experts' opinions. So they really put a lot of resource in CO2 storage. So this project is about 200 kilometers from Hong Kong. Take a helicopter, it's about 45 minutes to Enping 151 oil fields, and it will put a CO2 a bit like Steiner project, put a CO2 from the oil production, separate and inject back to the Sinai Formation for CO2 storage. And this project is very interesting because considerably the per square meters of land is more expensive than the capital investment of carbon capture because it's located in the center of Shenzhen, actually 5 kilometers from my home. This hub project will try to refurbish 6 times 300 megawatt coal-fired power plant into 2-3 times 660 megawatt coal-fired power plant. Building the phase 1 is building 500,000 ton carbon capture. You can see the picture from original picture is on the top, and they use also a conceptual design for coal-fired power plant. It looks like an exhibition center and after the refurbish, and all other pollutant will also be minimal. And they are also planning to build a CCUS technology incubation center. So if you have any collaboration idea, we can put forward. And in cement industry, actually, there are a few projects in preparation, and contracts already kick off the 50,000 ton CO2 capture. And a few other leading cement firms, including China Resource Cement, they're also planning some larger pilots and will be launched fairly soon. And in the steel sector, a few projects are in progress, and Portos Steel in Mongolia actually kick off the construction of 500,000 ton carbon capture and purification. And some of the CO2 go into EOR, and also some of the CO2 will use slag from the steel plant and convert the steel slag for other material production as a utilization. And the technology is quite interesting, and I've seen working closely with the firm. And this project you're probably familiar with Carfix, so we are working with Carfix, but another name is, if you use WeChat, and Tencent Group is one of the largest internet firms, but they also invest in carbon neutrality. So we work closely with Tencent and the Carfix, have a weekly meeting to investigate whether we can put CO2 down to shallow formation, shallow basalt area in the west of Guangdong province in Zhanjiang, because it will largely reduce the CO2 storage cost offshore if the mechanism is been proved to be successful. And there are a few other potential sites in China. And once the pilot project, we're going to start it injection next year and is successful, then we will scale up and look at other opportunity across the country. So this is also a very promising technology. And on the business side, we recently worked with China Petroleum University to look at Chinese CCUS roadmap. So I think OGCI's website have a short summary of a report on this regard, how CCUS may contribute to climate mitigation, but also bring in social economic benefit, includes GDP, job creation, and reduce energy security risk, etc. And there are also some roadmap to estimate CO2 reduction demand by CCUS by industry. And I can see since China announced a carbon neutrality goal, and actually the target will be met quite easily in the next few decades. So by 2030, the potential CCS deployment in the country, I think, is between 20 million ton to 200 million ton per annum. I think this range is sensible, and if the carbon pricing and regulation become more stringent, and the number can still going up further. And there are also potential for cost reduction. And we'll talk about financing, because in China, there are a lot of venture capital and investor interested in investing in CCS technology. So I can see there will also be some potential for rapid cost reduction to come through for both capture, transport, and the storage and the monitoring. So because of time, I wouldn't cover too much of this detail. And on financing, apart from the conventional finance process, China's People's Bank of China, the central bank, announced a concessional loan program for low carbon project, which also lists CCUS in the category. So many large banks are actively looking for CCUS project and could provide 1.75% concessional loan for CCUS, and if the project is qualified in the scheme. I think it's 300 billion yuan of money being allocated in the scheme to fund different low carbon technology with concessional finance. This is very much the presentation, but I think China still have a lot to learn from other countries and in the next decades. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Yes, back, John.
Thanks very much, Ian. So I'm sorry if you're in China and we're keeping you up late.
Don't worry.
The last thing you said, China's got a lot to learn. Well, I suppose everybody's got a lot to learn on CCS, but it looks like the world has a lot to learn from China as well if you get these projects done. How will we do that, do you think?
I think every country has its way to work. So in China, the good side is sometimes it can go very fast, but you skip a lot of regulatory barrier and a legal barrier to make demonstration projects to take place first. But maybe create a favorable environment for early stage demonstration projects and to allow mistakes coming out of the demonstration projects. For other things to learn, maybe the engineering capacity and the supply chain integration. But I believe there's still more China to learn from the West and the West to learn from China.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, George?
Hi, G. Stuart Hazeldine here.
Hi, sir.
Hi. Just to ask you about the Pearl River offshore project, did you, it was quite quick, but did you say that's a gas separation project offshore? So there's maybe no pipeline from the refinery out into the sea. It's all offshore platform related.
The project operational next year will just have a production platform for oil field in Enping and then inject a CO2 back. For the refinery, there will be a pipeline to transport CO2 from a refinery complex in Huizhou, which I think about 40 million to 50 million tons CO2 from one single site, and then get rid of some high concentration CO2 by pipeline to offshore platform. And Sino is still comparing different technical options, including pipeline shipping options.
Okay, thanks. And will Exxon be partners in that with the China National Oil Corporation?
Yes, I think so. I think UK embassy is actively engaged with Sino, so we can have another meeting to figure out possible way to work together.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's my question.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Maybe I ask one final question. My prerogative as chair, and we have lots of time for the reception. But final question on the cost reductions. You know, how you show very optimistic view in terms of some of the cost reductions over the next couple of decades. You know, how conscious is that built into the program in China in particular? Is there kind of a clear view of an effort to bring down costs?
Yes, I think there are some confidence from onshore wind, offshore wind. Offshore wind is mainly driven by UK, and also solar PV and battery, and China contribute to the process in the last couple of decades. The scales of the deployment, plus also people are fascinated with some breakthrough of new technology. So you can't imagine like Alibaba or Tencent, they all put a huge amount of money in CCUS. You will see more announcements in the next few months to see this kind of not long energy company. They put a lot of resource to try to identify what will be new idea that can break through, help them to pilot and scale up. So and apart from that, then there are also some commercial funds to put money to help scientists, engineers to scale up different new ideas.
Thank you, Steve. We'll let you get back to sleep. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks again.